For many years, I believed that learning English was something I would do later, not because I disliked it, and not because I thought it was impossible, but because my life already felt full of expectations, full of pressure, full of responsibilities that demanded results. I was living inside a system of achievement, where every effort had to lead somewhere visible, measurable, and meaningful to others. From a young age, I learned to value performance. Grades mattered. Recognition mattered. Progress was something you could point to. If you worked hard enough, people noticed. If you succeeded, you were safe. If you failed, you felt exposed. Over time, this way of thinking became natural to me. I didn't question it. I built my identity around outcomes. I learned how to appear capable, how to meet expectations, how to move from one goal to the next without pausing too long. On the surface, everything looked stable. I was not falling behind. I was not struggling in any obvious way. But inside, there was a constant tension, a quiet fear of failing. A fear that if I slowed down, I would fall out of place. English existed far outside this world. It felt like a risk without guarantee. Learning it would require time, effort, and patience, things I believed I couldn't afford unless the result was certain. I didn't want to be bad at something. I didn't want to start from the beginning. I was already exhausted from trying to be good enough. So I postponed it, again and again. Whenever English appeared in my life, in conversations, in job descriptions, in opportunities I quietly ignored, told myself it wasn't the right time. I was too busy. I had more important things to focus on. I would come back to it when life felt calmer, when I felt more confident, when I felt ready. Ready became a future version of myself that never arrived. Instead, the pressure increased. Responsibilities grew heavier. Expectations became less forgiving. I learned how to function efficiently, but I slowly forgot how to listen to myself. My days became structured around doing, producing, achieving. Rest felt unproductive. Uncertainty felt dangerous. There were moments, usually late at night, when I noticed how tired I felt, not physically, but mentally. Tired of measuring myself. Tired of maintaining an image. Tired of chasing a version of success that never seemed to settle. But even then, I didn't slow down. I distracted myself. I told myself this was normal. This was adulthood. English remained distant, not because it was difficult, but because it represented something unfamiliar. It represented being a beginner, making mistakes, not knowing what to say. It represented a space where I could not rely on achievement to protect me. And that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I believed that my worth was tied to competence, that struggling openly meant losing ground. So I stayed where I felt capable, where I knew the rules, where I could control outcomes. But control came at a cost. I noticed how little space there was in my life for curiosity, how rarely I allowed myself to explore something without needing it to pay off. I didn't call this fear. I called it responsibility. I told myself I was being realistic. In truth, I was avoiding discomfort. The more I avoided it, the smaller my world became. Not visibly, not dramatically, quietly. My routines tightened. My thinking narrowed. I stayed busy enough not to ask questions that might disturb the balance I had built. I didn't feel unhappy, but I didn't feel open either. There were moments when I watched others speak English slowly, imperfectly, confidently, despite their mistakes, and something stirred inside me. Not envy, not admiration, something closer to recognition, as if a part of me remembered what it felt like to learn without fear. I dismissed those moments quickly. I told myself they were irrelevant. I had chosen a different path. I was doing fine, but fine began to feel heavy. I started to notice how often I reacted defensively when things didn't go as planned. How quickly frustration appeared when I felt uncertain. How deeply I feared being seen as unprepared or inadequate. These reactions felt automatic, but they left me drained. I didn't connect these feelings to English. Not yet. At this stage, English was still just a language, a tool, something external. I didn't realize it was quietly pointing toward something internal, something unresolved. I continued living the way I always had, achieving, maintaining, avoiding visible failure. I believed that if I stayed consistent enough, life would eventually feel easier. That pressure would decrease, that confidence would arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was fatigue, a kind of exhaustion that didn't go away with rest, a feeling that I was constantly holding something together, afraid that if I loosened my grip, everything would collapse. I didn't know yet that the grip itself was the problem. I didn't know yet that learning English would eventually challenge not my ability, but my identity. For now, I stayed where I felt safe, where I felt competent, where results protected me from uncertainty, and English remained very far away, not because it wasn't important, but because I was afraid of what it would ask me to face. After years of living inside pressure, something subtle began to change. Not suddenly, and not dramatically. There was no breaking point, no failure that forced me to stop. Instead, there was a quiet accumulation of tiredness, a tiredness that no longer disappeared after rest, a tiredness that came from constantly proving myself. I began to notice how often my mind was calculating, measuring whether I was doing enough, comparing where I stood against where I believed I should be. Even during moments that were supposed to be calm, my thoughts were busy, planning, evaluating, anticipating the next demand. I told myself this was responsibility, that this was what it meant to be serious about life. But deep down, I felt something else. A sense that I was always preparing, but never arriving. Always bracing myself, but never relaxing. One evening, after a long day that had gone exactly as planned, I felt unexpectedly empty. Nothing bad had happened. I had met expectations. I had done what was required. Yet instead of satisfaction, there was only silence. A silence that felt exposed. I sat with that feeling longer than usual. Normally, I would distract myself quickly, but this time I didn't. I noticed how unfamiliar it felt to be alone with my thoughts without immediately organizing them. I noticed how quickly discomfort made me want to escape, and that was when English crossed my mind again, not as a task, not as a goal, but as a question. Why did the idea of learning English still feel so threatening to me? The answer came slowly. It wasn't about difficulty. It was about identity. Learning English would place me back at the beginning. It would require me to sound unsure, to hesitate, to make mistakes in front of myself, and possibly in front of others. For someone who had spent years building a sense of worth around competence, that felt dangerous. I realized how tightly I had linked my value to performance. How deeply I believed that being capable meant being safe. English challenged that belief without saying a word. It simply existed as something I could not control immediately. That realization stayed with me. It followed me into my daily routines. I began to notice how often I avoided situations where I might look inexperienced. How often I chose familiarity over curiosity. How carefully I curated my environment to protect myself from feeling inadequate. This awareness was uncomfortable, not because it was painful, but because it was honest. I could no longer tell myself that English was irrelevant. It was relevant precisely because it touched the part of me that feared exposure. I didn't decide to change. I didn't tell myself I needed to become better. Those thoughts felt too heavy. Instead, I allowed myself to observe, to notice my reactions without judging them, to admit, quietly, that fear had been guiding more of my choices than I wanted to believe. There were moments when I almost acted, almost opened an English video, almost listened to a story, and then closed it again. The hesitation was familiar. The same hesitation that appeared whenever something felt uncertain. But one day, without much thought, I didn't close it. I didn't tell myself I was starting anything. I didn't set a goal. I didn't even focus on understanding. I just listened. Not actively, not carefully, just enough to stay. The voice was slow, calm, imperfect in places. The speaker paused often, sometimes searching for words, sometimes repeating a thought, and nothing bad happened that surprised me. There was no pressure in the voice, no urgency to sound impressive, just presence, just continuation. I noticed how different this felt from the way I usually approached learning. There were no expectations, no comparison, no measurement. I could stop at any moment. That freedom made it possible to continue. I began listening occasionally. Not every day, not consistently. Just when I felt open enough. English entered my life quietly, without demand. And because it asked for nothing, I gave it attention. I noticed how my body responded. The tension I usually carried in my chest softened slightly. My breathing slowed. I wasn't performing. I wasn't achieving. I was simply listening. That experience unsettled something in me. It showed me a way of being that didn't revolve around results. A way of engaging without pressure, without fear of failure. I didn't trust it at first. It felt too gentle, too unstructured, too uncertain. But it also felt honest. Slowly, I began to see that my fear of failure had not protected me. It had narrowed me. It had kept me busy, but not fulfilled. Capable, but not open. English was no longer just a language. It was becoming a mirror, reflecting how I treated uncertainty. How I treated myself when I wasn't immediately good at something. I didn't yet feel ready to change my life. I didn't feel brave. But I felt curious. And curiosity, unlike motivation, did not demand certainty. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to stay with something unfamiliar without turning away. And that quiet decision began to loosen the grip that fear had held on me for years. I didn't know where this path would lead. I didn't need to. For now, it was enough that I had stopped running. As English quietly became part of my days, I noticed something I hadn't expected. The pressure that had always followed learning did not appear. There was no voice urging me to hurry, no inner judge demanding proof of progress. Instead, there was a sense of space, a space where I could listen without needing to understand everything, where I could stay without needing to perform. This felt unfamiliar. For most of my life, effort had been tied to results. If I put time into something, I expected a clear return. If improvement wasn't visible, I questioned whether it was worth continuing. English disrupted that pattern gently. It offered no immediate validation. And because of that, it began to teach me patience. There were days when I understood almost nothing, days when the sounds felt distant, when meaning slipped past me. In the past, that would have frustrated me. I would have labeled the experience inefficient. This time, I stayed, not because I was disciplined, but because leaving no longer felt necessary. I began to notice how my body responded when I didn't rush. My shoulders relaxed. My breathing slowed. I wasn't bracing myself for failure. I was allowing myself to be present with uncertainty. That presence felt grounding. This change began to influence how I approached other areas of my life. At work, I noticed how quickly I usually tried to prove competence. How often I spoke before, fully thinking, just to appear prepared. Now, I paused more. I listened longer. I didn't rush to fill silence. To my surprise, nothing collapsed. In fact, conversations felt clearer. I realized how much energy I had spent avoiding the feeling of not knowing, how exhausting it had been to always appear certain. English gave me permission to let go of that performance, at least in one small area, and that permission began to spread. There were moments when I caught myself making mistakes in English, mispronouncing a word, misunderstanding a phrase, and instead of feeling embarrassed, I felt curious. I wanted to understand why. That shift mattered. Curiosity replaced judgment. Exploration replaced defense. I started to notice patterns. The moments that frustrated me most were not the difficult ones, but the ones where I expected myself to be better. When I removed that expectation, difficulty became manageable, even interesting. This realization reached deeper than language. I saw how often my fear of failure had shaped my decisions. How many paths I hadn't taken because I didn't want to look unprepared. How often I had chosen certainty over growth. English was slowly changing my relationship with failure. It was showing me that failure, when allowed, loses much of its power. It becomes information instead of identity. I didn't become confident overnight. I still hesitated. I still doubted myself. But those doubts no longer stopped me immediately. They became part of the process instead of the end of it. I also noticed how my definition of success began to shift. Success was no longer about mastering something quickly. It was about staying engaged, about returning even when things felt unclear, about not abandoning myself when progress was slow. This change affected how I spoke to myself. The harsh internal commentary softened. I stopped demanding constant improvement. I allowed plateaus. I allowed repetition. I allowed myself to be where I was. English became a quiet companion in this process. Not something I conquered, but something I walked with. Some days we moved slowly. Some days barely at all, and that was okay. I began to trust consistency over intensity. Small moments of attention over dramatic effort. I understood that learning, like growth, happens in layers. And those layers required time. There were moments when I looked back at my earlier self, the one driven by fear of failure, by pressure to achieve. I felt compassion, not judgment. I understood why I had lived that way. It had protected me, but it had also limited me. Now I was learning another way, a way that didn't promise safety but offered honesty, a way that didn't eliminate uncertainty but made room for it. I realized that English was not something I needed to master in order to prove my worth. It was something I could practice to understand myself better. It revealed how I responded to challenge, to slowness, to imperfection. And what it revealed was this: I was capable of staying with difficulty, staying with confusion, staying with myself. That realization felt steady, quiet, real. I didn't know yet what this would lead to. I didn't need to. What mattered was that I had stopped measuring every step. I had stopped asking whether I was doing enough. I was doing something different. I was learning how to remain, and that, I was beginning to see, was the foundation for everything that would come next. At some point, I stopped asking myself when I would finally feel confident. That question had followed me for years, quietly shaping my expectations. I believed confidence was a destination, a state you arrive at after enough effort, enough proof, enough success. But what I was experiencing now felt different. Confidence did not arrive. Acceptance did. I accepted that uncertainty would always be part of my life, that hesitation did not mean weakness, that moving slowly did not mean I was failing. It simply meant I was paying attention. English no longer felt like something outside of me. It had woven itself into my days in small, unremarkable ways. I listened without pressure. I spoke without demanding perfection. I allowed pauses. I allowed mistakes. And through that allowance, I began to trust myself again, not because I was good, but because I was honest. This honesty began to affect how I lived. I stopped over-preparing for conversations. I stopped rehearsing everything I wanted to say in advance. I allowed myself to show up as I was, even when my thoughts were incomplete. I discovered that people didn't require certainty from me. They responded to presence. That realization softened something deep inside me. For years, I had been carrying the weight of expectation, the expectation to perform, to prove, to avoid failure at all costs. Learning English gently loosened that weight. It showed me that effort does not have to be heavy to be meaningful. There were still moments when fear appeared, moments when I felt exposed, moments when I wanted to retreat to familiar ground. But those moments no longer controlled my decisions. I noticed them, I acknowledged them, and then I stayed. Staying became my quiet practice. I stayed with English even when progress felt invisible. I stayed in conversations even when I didn't know the right words. I stayed with myself even when I felt unsure. Through staying, something unexpected happened. I began to feel lighter. Not because life became easier, but because I stopped fighting my own experience. I stopped treating discomfort as an enemy. I saw it as a signal that I was alive, engaged, participating. Looking back, I understand now that my fear of failure had never been about failing. It had been about identity. I was afraid that mistakes would define me. English taught me that mistakes pass. Presence remains. I didn't become fluent overnight. I didn't suddenly open doors or transform my career. But something more important changed. I changed how I related to learning, to effort, to myself. I no longer believed that worth came from being flawless. I believed it came from being willing. Willing to begin, willing to continue, willing to stay. If you are listening to this and feel held back by fear of failing, fear of being slow, fear of not being good enough, want to say this gently. You don't need to wait for confidence to start. Confidence grows after you stay, not before. English, like life, does not demand that you be ready. It asks that you be present. It invites you to speak imperfectly, to listen patiently, to move forward without guarantees. You don't need to rush. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to know exactly where this path will lead. You only need to take one small step and remain long enough to see what changes inside you. I am still learning. I still hesitate. I still make mistakes. But I no longer see those moments as failures. I see them as signs that I am participating in my own life, instead of observing it from a distance. And that participation has made all the difference. English did not remove fear from my life. It taught me how to live with it without letting it decide for me. That lesson has stayed quietly, steadily, one moment at a time. Thank you for staying with this story, for listening without rushing. And if you take one thing with you, let it be this: you don't need certainty to move forward. You only need the courage to stay present when things feel unclear. That is where growth truly begins.